But thanks everyone for joining us today. This is the final PhD dissertation defense for James Harper, and I'm Angela Bielefeld. I am one of his co-advisors along with Amy Javernick-Will. And James started back when we had a U.S. Department of Education GAN fellowship program. And so that gave him a lot of flexibility to pick a topic that was really within his interest area, which is really exciting. And so I think, James, you've got a little bit of background kicking it off, like this topic in the broader context. So I'll leave that to you. But as Amy said, if you have some questions that are clarifying during the presentation itself, you can type them in the chat and Amy will be looking at them. And if it turns out that it feels like we can wait till the end, we'll do that. Or hold on to your questions and we'll have time for public questions at the end of the presentation. So I'll let James kick it away.
That sounds great. Thanks so much, Angie. Hi, my name is James Harper. Thank you very much for taking a piece of your afternoon to spend with me and learn about my PhD research that's titled Fecal Sludge Management in Rural Low Resource Contexts, Understanding Decision-Making by Households in Cambodia. This presentation is going to walk you through the motivation, background, and context of my research. I'll also present my methods to you. And then we'll dive into the results from the 3 different studies that came out from my research. And to wrap up, I'll provide you a summary as well as the recommendations I'm making to the rural Cambodian sanitation sector. So first off, some logistics. This is the public portion. I'm going to gloss over this in a little bit of, just because we've already kind of touched on these. If your computer hasn't already sorted this out, if you want to see my talking face in the top right of your slide, you can click on the single gray bar in the little mini video window. That's the show active speaker video. And then you can move me to the top right of the slide. There should be a space there so that text doesn't get covered up. And then we'll have approximately 15 minutes for questions at the end, but as we've been saying, go ahead and add those to the Zoom chat and Amy will watch those as we're going through. And then we'll say goodbye to the public and go into the committee-only portion where I'll get some difficult questions asked about my research, and hopefully I'll be one step closer to getting my PhD at the end of this. So first off, some acknowledgements. Many people have supported me and provided a lot of guidance to me over the past 4.5 years to make this research possible. First and foremost, our IDE, an international development organization that I've worked with a lot for all of my research, and everyone I've worked with has been truly excellent. Visna, Chris, Tyler, Gordon, Greg, and all the survey enumerators that collected all of my data. Thank you so much for everything that you do. It's been a true honor, and I hope to work with you again in the future. Similarly, my advisors, Angie and Amy, have been integral to me becoming a better researcher and have been really helpful in preparing me for my career goals after the fact. So thank you both very much. My primary research group, the GPO research group, I learned a lot in terms of presenting better and writing better over the many years of working with you guys. So thank you very much for all that guidance. My committee members, Sherry, Amanda, and Katie, were really important to developing the study design as well as all the data analysis looking forward from before I started all of my studies. And Katie was also an author on the second paper that I'll be presenting to you today. The Thomas Research Group I've been involved with more recently, so thanks go out to Evan, Laura, Taylor, Chantal, and Matthew for some good conversations that have, again, pushed me towards being a better researcher. Various colleagues along the way have helped with study design and data analysis. Ben Shear, Ray Littlejohn, and Marion Jenkins, thank you very much. And of course, my lovely wife, Devin, my family and my friends, all of your support over these many years has really enabled me to do what I did. So thank you so much. More broadly, the Mortensen Center in Global Engineering at CU Boulder, I've learned a ton through classwork, but also a lot more through the excellent faculty, staff, and students here at CU. And lastly, my funders. Rotary District 5450 provided me a lot of conference funding over the years, as well as the Department of Education, as Angie mentioned, that funded my fellowship. So thanks go out to everyone on the screen. A little bit of background about me. I grew up in a small farming town called Gilroy, California, the garlic capital of the world, or at least it was 100 years ago. And then went to high school in Monterey, California at York School. Upon graduating, I moved down to San Diego, where I pursued my bachelor's and master's degrees in mechanical engineering at the University of California, San Diego. While studying my undergrad, I studied abroad at the University of Auckland for 1 year, where I also worked at New Zealand Steel as an engineer for 6 months. And I also had the pleasure of traveling to Southeast Asia for the first time because it's a lot closer to New Zealand. And that's where I really fell in love with that part of the world. Upon returning to the States and completing my degrees, I became a mechanical design engineer, working primarily in aerospace, high-powered laser optics, and medical devices. But I soon realized that I really wanted to teach. So I started teaching project-based engineering at various high schools in San Diego. I sure wish that that had been something that I had had when I was in high school. And during that time, I also got involved with Engineers Without Borders in India. I soon became the lead engineer on a couple different projects there that worked on water treatment, solar power, as well as housing construction. And that housing construction project is actually still going on. Having fallen in love with teaching and international development, I decided to go back to graduate school for a PhD in civil systems engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder. After my first year, I effectively moved to Cambodia for 2 months to work with IDE for the first time during my practicum, which is part of the degree here. And I studied rural fecal sludge management there, and that kind of started me on my research in that field. Later on, I also got to present some of my research in Croatia at the EPOC conference, and also got to perform some field research with IDE looking at both households and service providers of fecal sludge management in rural Bangladesh, which was a truly amazing experience. More recently, I got to present some of my research at FSM 5, that's Fecal Sludge Management 5, a conference in Cape Town, South Africa. And then the next big milestone is today, actually, which is coming to the end of my PhD. So a little bit of background about fecal sludge management in general. Currently, there are 3.4 billion people around the world using latrines in rural areas. So this means no sewers, no wastewater treatment plants. These are on-site systems that rely on something called fecal sludge management. And fecal sludge management typically requires 6 different steps to be performed safely. That's capture and containment, followed by emptying, transport, treatment, and safe for use or disposal of fecal sludge. And fecal sludge is simply the feces and urine that we all produce. So the first 2 are the steps that us Westerners are typically more familiar with. Those are the toilets that capture our fecal sludge, and then on-site containment systems. So in a Western setting, this is typically going to be a septic tank, but in more rural areas in other parts of the world, these are going to be subterranean pits that are typically concrete lined, like a pit latrine would have. My research in particular looks at the last 4 steps of fecal sludge management. That's emptying, transport, treatment, and safe for use or disposal. So emptying can range in complexity from manual emptying with something like a shovel or a bucket up to something as complicated as a vacuum truck, which is what would empty a septic tank here in the US. Transporting fecal sludge can, again, be something as simple as a bucket up to a trike that could carry a 50-gallon barrel up to a vacuum truck. Treatment can take many different forms, but typically at a fecal sludge treatment plant, drying would be used to remove the pathogens from fecal sludge. However, there are also latrine designs like this alternating dual pit system that can provide on-site treatment at a household using something called storage treatment, which I'll talk a little bit about more later. And then lastly, the solids that are left over in fecal sludge need to either be landfilled or composted to create some kind of agricultural amendment like a fertilizer. However, typically in rural areas, you'll find that disposal occurs before treatment or without any treatment into fields or into water bodies like in this picture here. So why does this matter? In general, sanitation has been shown to affect many aspects of society, including public health, the environment, and the economy. So a couple tidbits of information. Diarrheal diseases are primarily caused by poor sanitation, and they represent 10% of the global burden of disease and kill approximately 3.5 million people annually. With regard to the economics, studies have shown that there's a 5.5 to 1 benefit to cost ratio of universal sanitation. So that means that for every dollar invested in sanitation, $5.50 are created in the economy due to lower healthcare costs, fewer lost days at work, and improved school attendance, just to name a few things. Now in rural areas, FSM is typically performed using unsafe practices. You'll find households emptying without protective gear, not providing treatment, and disposing directly into the environment. Before I go on to the next slide, I just want to call your attention to the red text that you'll start seeing throughout my presentation. Those are to indicate either unsafe practices or something that supports an unsafe practice. And you'll also see green text, which is the opposite. So, these are safe practices or things that support safe practices. So why is rural FSM typically unsafe? There are two main reasons. Because it's a rural area, low population densities mean that the latrines that need to have their fecal sludge managed tend to be distant from one another. And that means that it's expensive to transport fecal sludge over those distances. As a result, businesses aren't particularly profitable, so therefore there aren't very many services that provide FSM to rural areas. And secondly, and this is a pretty big one, there tend to be very few standards and certainly a lack of regulation of FSM in rural areas. So ultimately, you have billions of households deciding how to manage their own fecal sludge. So when they're deciding between bucketing all the way up to something like a vacuum truck, their decisions really determine how fecal sludge is managed and thus how safe sanitation is. So when we're designing FSM practices and services and the programs that support them, which are typically sanitation marketing and behavior change campaigns, they really need to, first off, achieve safe sanitation, of course, that's the whole goal, but they also need to meet the needs and preferences of households that are deciding which practice to use. And that motivates the overarching research question for my research is what motivates how households manage fecal sludge in low resource rural contexts. So before I dive into my specific research, I wanted to give you just a primer on how people make decisions. So behavioral science has investigated how people make decisions for decades, and most accepted theories agree that people make decisions based on these things called behavioral determinants. And these are things in our lives that determine our behavior. I base most of my research on the well-established theory of planned behavior, which states that people make decisions based on the following behavioral determinants. First off is context. That's simply the environment where the decision is being made. So context can be described by personal factors such as the age of the decision maker, their past experience with, in this case, fecal sludge, their gender, income, or religion, physical factors like geography, what season it currently is, and what the climate's like, and also social factors like their culture, what the economy is currently doing, and how politics are organized. All of these things influence how we make decisions. Second behavioral determinant is knowledge. What do the decision makers know about the decision? So are they aware of the different options available to them to solve this problem, to make this decision? Are they aware of the importance of the decision? And do they understand the details of the different practices that might be available to them? Third is attitudes. How do decision makers feel about the options available to them? A positive or negative feeling about a practice or the potential outcomes from that practice can strongly influence how people make decisions. Fourth is social norms, and that's basically what will the neighbors think? A positive or negative feeling about, perceptions of how a practice will be perceived by others tend to strongly influence how people make decisions. Fifth is control. Do the decision makers have the resources that they need? So this is typically time, money, or physical ability. And then do the decision makers feel that they have the resources that they need? So are they willing to spend the money for this practice, or are they willing to spend the time to perform that other practice? And lastly, intentions. What do the decision makers intend to do given all these other factors? Typically, context is thought to feed into the next four: knowledge, attitude, social norms, and control. And then those four are internal processes leading to intentions, and those immediately precede the actual performance of a behavior. So for my research, I selected Cambodia, a small country in Southeast Asia, and which is surrounded by Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Its population is approximately 80% rural, and in recent years, latrine access has really exploded in rural Cambodia in particular. And commensurately, open defecation, that's going to the bathroom outside without a toilet, has decreased by not quite as much. Now, unfortunately, safely managed rural sanitation in Cambodia is particularly rare. There are no fecal sludge treatment plants in rural Cambodia, and there are only a few wastewater treatment plants for the sewer systems in the larger cities. However, these wastewater treatment plants are typically difficult to access from rural areas due to the distances involved. So regarding rural FSM services, Obviously, pit installers are pretty common because somebody had to build all those latrines. But pit emptiers are particularly rare because there's basically been a delay in the development of that FSM service market to support the emptying and management of all the fecal sludge being stored in all those pits. There are also no rural FSM standards in Cambodia. However, this year, the Cambodian national government did release some rural FSM guidelines, which is definitely a step in the right direction. So overall, FSM in rural Cambodia is marked by households that frequently self-empty, that's emptying their own pit, without treatment, and dispose of fecal sludge directly into water bodies and crop fields. So in order to understand this very localized context of rural Cambodia, I really needed a research partner that knew rural Cambodia well, and that is IDE. They've been working on sanitation in rural Cambodia for decades and really understand the context and understand the details of going out and gathering data and doing research there. So they've participated in every aspect of my research, all the way from study design, survey development, data collection, and data analysis. So for my research, I used 2 different surveys to describe FSM decision-making in 7 and 5 provinces, respectively. The first survey was an existing survey that, in addition to demographics, looked at 2 behavioral determinants related to FSM. That was context and intentions. The survey was administered to 3,751 households in 7 provinces over a 3-year period, 2015 to 2017. And we'll hear more about this survey in the first study that I present shortly. The second survey was a survey that IDE and I developed effectively from scratch. Obviously, we used a lot of input from local Cambodian literature that had researched FSM in the past, as well as IDE's survey experience prior to this. But the goal of this survey was to comprehensively describe FSM decision-making in rural Cambodia. So it looks at all 6 of those behavioral determinants related to FSM. And it also includes something called the discrete choice experiment, which allows us to quantify households' preferences and willingness to pay for FSM service attributes. And we'll learn more about this again in my second study here. The FSM survey was administered to 1,472 households in 5 provinces in 2019, using cluster randomized sampling of 5 villages per district and 6 households per village. And that's actually the map that I'm showing here. You can see the 5 different provinces, and those black dots are all the villages that were visited for that survey. All right, so at this point, I'm going to start presenting the results of my 3 different studies. I'm just going to check the chat here to make sure that I'm not missing anything that people might be saying. Okay. Amy, feel free to interrupt me if I'm not seeing something in the chat.
I will, yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so my first study looked at context and intentions related to rural FSM in Cambodia. And the study was motivated by the fact that intentions to perform different FSM practices can be influenced and may even be predicted by contextual and demographic factors. And this study was published this year, open access, in the Journal of Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene for Development. So in that first survey, we asked the question, when your pit is getting full, what do you intend to do? And we defined the responses to this question as an FSM intention for that specific household. So there were 6 different responses. The first 2, hiring a service and installing a new pit, we considered desirable FSM intentions. And these allow for complete emptying, allow for continuous latrine use, and allow for the opportunity for safe emptying. So for example, hiring a service provides the opportunity for safe emptying because regulating services is at least possible, while regulating how every single household empties their own latrine pit would be effectively impossible. The other 4 responses, self-emptying, stopping use of a latrine, being undecided, or having some other response were categorized as undesirable because they likely wouldn't lead to safe emptying. So we analyzed response frequencies, associations between desirability and context, and then also used binomial logistic regression to see how context interacts with intentions. So from their survey responses, we found 41% of households reported undesirable FSM intentions, and 21% of those were self-emptying and 16% were undecided. The self-emptying result wasn't too surprising just because we kind of knew that self-emptying was pretty common. However, so many people being undecided was a bit of a surprise. This broadly indicated either a lack of awareness of available methods, a lack of concern over managing fecal sludge, or just simply that lack of services that we talked about. So starting to look at some of the contextual factors, I found that poverty did influence FSM intentions. I found that ID poor households, which are households that the Cambodian national government has identified as poor, slightly favored the free practice of self-emptying by 3%. And non-ID poor households slightly favored the relatively expensive practice of installing a new pit by 4%. Now, these are pretty small percentages, admittedly, but when you start thinking about the number of people involved in this survey and the number of people that the results can be generalized to, which is in the millions, these percentages do end up mattering when you start thinking about policy implementation and subsidies and all those things that go into making sure that infrastructure is available to everyone. Also taking a look at the year that the survey was administered, we found an increase in the desirability over the 3 years from 51 up to 63%. And intentions specifically to install a new pit doubled from 13 to 26% over that 3-year period. Now, increasing familiarity with installing a new pit has likely occurred due to the vast marketing of, in particular, alternating dual pits, but also surveying such as this that just makes people think about FSM in general. So we also took a look at how household location affects FSM intentions. So before I dive in, I just want to explain the graph here. On the vertical axis, we have provinces, and they're arranged from north to south, and they border each other. So Uttaramanche will border Bantamanche and all the way down the line. You'll also see a percentage of rural latrine owners on the horizontal axis and grouped by desirable FSM intentions on the left and undesirable on the right. So you can see that there are clear preferences for different FSM practices in each province. So first off, taking a look at this hiring service result, that's the lighter blue bars on the left, we find that economies within provinces might be an important factor. So if we compare Bantamanche and Kandal, you can see that they have a lot of households reporting FSM intentions to hire a service. And these tend to be the more affluent provinces in rural Cambodia. It's not to mean that they are particularly affluent on the global scale, but affluent compared to the other provinces in Cambodia. So if we compare those two to the provinces of Prey Veng and Svay Rieng, you can see that they are not intending to hire a service as much as the other two. And commensurately, Prey Veng and Svay Rieng are less affluent provinces in rural Cambodia. So the strength of the economy or the availability of jobs or other aspects of the economy might be influencing FSM intentions. However, it's never that simple with social sciences. Uttaramanche up here is a relatively poor province, and you can see that many households are intending to hire a service there. So the economy likely plays a role, but it's definitely not the whole story. Also taking a look at Svay Rieng down here, we see that many households are intending to install a new pit. That's the darker blue bar here. And self-emptying and being undecided were particularly favored in Siem Reap. So unfortunately, our data, well, obviously there's effects here of province on intentions. There's not enough information to really describe why. There really needs to just be more data in order to explain these variations that we don't currently have. So overall, we've seen that context does affect intentions, but it still doesn't tell us enough. Using binomial logistic regression, we tried to see if we could predict FSM intentions based on the contextual factors of a given household. So we took a look at where households were located, what month the survey was administered in, what the household's experience with open defecation has been, etc., and a couple other different factors here to see if we could predict those intentions. So based on just the survey results, we know that of households in rural Cambodia, 59% have desirable FSM intentions already, right? That's just something that we can tell from the survey results. So if I were to go pick a random household in rural Cambodia, I would have a 59% accurate chance of guessing the desirability of their FSM intentions just based on the survey. So this model should give us a lot more accuracy. Unfortunately, it doesn't. The model gives us a little bit more accuracy at 67% in predicting that FSM intention desirability, but ultimately it really doesn't give us that much more information, especially considering all the details that were put into this model. So ultimately, this result tells us that to really understand intentions and decision-making more broadly, we really need to investigate more behavioral determinants than just context. All right, so now I'll move on to my second study, which looks at preferences for FSM service attributes. This study was motivated by the fact that describing which attributes of FSM services are preferred by households will help us develop the FSM service markets that support services. And this study was recently accepted at Environmental Science and Technology and is currently in press. So FSM services can take two different forms. I've already talked to you a little bit about the emptying form of FSM services. So that's where they would empty a pit, transport, treat, and dispose or reuse of the fecal sludge. Emptying can take the form of manual emptying with a bucket or a bucket on a rope or a shovel. Something a little bit more complicated would be mechanical emptying using a submersible pump and piping, all the way up to a vacuum truck. But you can also have FSM services that simply install a new pit. You could simply replicate that single pit latrine and build one right next to it, creating more capacity for another couple years of fecal sludge storage. Or you could install a new pit alongside the existing system. So in this case, sludge is flushed from the latrine into the first pit. When that first pit starts filling up, the liquid at the top spills over via a connecting pipe into the second pit, basically creating a simple septic tank system. Or you could have an alternating dual pit system. The toilet is initially connected to the first single pit. That first pit fills up. When that pit is filled, the pipe is physically cut, and the toilet is connected to the second pit. As that second pit fills up, the first pit just kind of sits there and undergoes what's called storage treatment. By the time the second pit fills up, the first pit can then be relatively safely emptied by the rural households themselves due to that storage treatment. So there are lots of different options that FSM services can provide and different methods they can use. Now, the market and methods used really are going to depend on how households value those different attributes of those services. And that's what this study looks at. First off, which attributes of FSM services do rural households prefer? And what are they willing to pay for them? So the study uses something called the discrete choice experiment to describe the stated preferences and willingness to pay for FSM service attributes by rural Cambodian households. So we used a discrete choice experiment because it's considered the gold standard for determining stated preferences of products or services with multiple different attributes. And it's particularly useful when designing a product or service in order to prioritize those critical traits that product or service should really focus on. So in this study, we described FSM services with 5 different attributes, and those attributes were chosen based on Cambodia-specific literature. The literature has shown that rural Cambodian households find different things to be important regarding sanitation, and that's what we tried to include with these attributes. So the 5 different attributes that were included are the rows of this table. So first is, does the service prevent contact with fecal sludge? Either yes or no. Can the fecal sludge fertilize crops after emptying? Either yes or no. How disgusting is the smell produced by the service, ranging from not disgusting up to very disgusting? Gotta love those pictures. How many days pass between service request and service delivery? 1 day up to 30 days. And what is the cost of the service, ranging from 50,000 rial up to 250,000 rial? And that's about $10 US to 60 US dollars. And as you can see, we used visual aids for each of these levels to mitigate any issues of literacy in our respondent pool. So each household was asked 5 different questions, and each of those questions asked them to select one of 3 options that they prefer over the other shown options. So a question would typically look like this. You can see those 5 attributes describing options A and B. And those attribute levels varied by question. So in this particular question, option A does prevent contact with fecal sludge, but does not produce fertilizer, whereas option B does not prevent contact, but does produce fertilizer. And you can see the other levels describing options A and B there. Now these attribute levels varied according to a block fractional factorial design, which is a pretty fancy way of reducing the number of questions that we asked while still getting enough data to answer our research question. And you also see that there's a third option, option C, and this is the non-service option or the neither A or B option. And these are for the households that really don't want to spend money on either A or B for that particular question. Option C was informed by a previous survey question for that specific household. What would you do if no FSM service were available? And responses to this question included emptying your own pit, opening a pit during a flood, using a neighbor's latrine, or reverting to open defecation. So because the discrete choice experiment is pretty complicated, we really needed to train our enumerators quite heavily in order to make sure that the data we gathered was of very high quality. So I started by creating some video tutorials here in the States that walked them through the scripts and posed different questions that respondents would likely have for them and potential answers for those questions. Then we broke our enumerators up into groups where they would role play. They would have the opportunity to ask the questions as well as respond to them so they could understand the issues on either side of the coin there. And then we finally did field testing, where we went out into a rural Cambodian village in Siem Reap and actually tested these questions on real households that were not included in the final data collection. Based on all of this training and practice, we changed a couple of the images and also changed some of the local Khmer wordings. The Khmer is the local language in Cambodia. And it was pretty amazing to see these pictures. You know, again, I'm sitting here in the US, and to see these pictures out in the real world was quite cool. So taking a look at the results, again, I'm going to explain the graph to you. So on the vertical axis, we have the model coefficient, but you can think of that basically as higher indicates more preference for the 4 different attributes here along the horizontal axis. So first off, I want to call your attention to the fact this is a very high quality model. It has a McFadden's R-squared value of 0.31. This isn't your typical R-squared that ranges from 0 to 1. A McFadden R-squared ranges from 0 to 0.4, and anything over 0.2 is considered a very good model. So we asked enough questions, and we were able to answer our research questions with this, which is pretty cool. As you can see, the strongest preference was for preventing contact with fecal sludge, which is particularly good because that's also a goal of safe sanitation in general. Followed by reducing foul odor, producing fertilizer from fecal sludge, and then reducing time to service delivery. This last bar is, I just wanted to make a quick point on this one. This is reducing time to service delivery by 1 week. So as the weeks mount, you can imagine kind of adding more bars on top of this of the same height. And so at 4 weeks, the preference for reduced time to service delivery approximately equals the preference for producing fertilizer from fecal sludge. So all of the attributes that we included were preferred by rural Cambodian households. You'll also note the significant standard deviations indicated by the error bars on the tops of these bars. And that indicates something called preference heterogeneity. And that basically means that preferences for FSM service attributes across the population are really going to vary from one household to another. What we're showing here are the mean preferences across the whole population. But if you compare one household, it might really care about preventing contact with fecal sludge, but not so much the other 3. Whereas its next door neighbor might really care about reducing foul odor and only slightly care about preventing contact. So there's going to be a lot of variations in preferences across the population. So based on these results, obviously FSM services really need to match these household preferences because this is what households care about. So obviously I'm recommending that FSM services really prevent contact with fecal sludge, obviously also to help move towards safe sanitation. But also I'm recommending that FSM services offer pricing tiers that for households that really want to reduce foul odor, produce fertilizer, or reduce time to service delivery. FSM services should also be marketed using these attributes because we know households care about them. Now from this graph, we can also take a look at willingness to pay. And all I'm going to do is change the vertical axis. So now we're looking at the same attributes, but how much rural households are willing to pay for them, ranging from 0 up to 263,000 Cambodian rial. That doesn't really mean anything to you and actually not to me either, so we need to have some comparison values. For example, the mean monthly income in rural Cambodia is 750,000 rial. Pit emptying costs between 60 and 300,000 rial, and new pits tend to cost around 200,000 rial. So overall, we're seeing some really high willingness to pay values here. And what's even more important to note is that what these numbers show is how much a rural household is willing to pay in addition to a basic service that doesn't have these attributes. So what this is telling us is that just to prevent contact with fecal sludge, not for the service itself, but just to prevent contact, rural households are willing to pay almost as much as it would cost to empty the pit by itself. So overall, what we're seeing is some type of bias in our results. And most likely this is coming from hypothetical bias. And this is really common in stated preference studies like discrete choice experiments. And it basically represents the difficulty in a respondent really putting themselves in the position of having to spend that money. It's very difficult to really replicate that actual real world decision when you ask somebody what will they pay, even with something as complicated as a discrete choice experiment like this. So although the willingness to pay values that we came out with here aren't necessarily valid, the relative preferences that we're seeing here are. So ultimately from this study, we're also recommending that willingness to pay for these FSM service attributes really needs to be confirmed with a revealed preference study. That's what people will actually pay for these different attributes by determining the actual market value for these FSM service attributes. All right, and then moving on to the third study, which looks at acceptance of safe FSM practices in rural Cambodia. This study was motivated by the fact that identifying how and where households are either accepting of or resistant to safe FSM practices can help us develop FSM practices and services and the programs that support them, marketing and policy typically. So the perceptions of an innovation, which is a new product or service that's introduced to a population, tends to vary across a population and with time. Typically, you'll have early adopters that are really excited about an innovation and accept it early on. And then you also have what are called the late adopters that are initially more resistant to that innovation early on and become more accepting over time. So safe FSM practices in rural Cambodia can be considered an innovation because they're relatively new to the area and people don't tend to be particularly familiar with them just yet. So in understanding where we are on this curve along time is really important at this point to understand how households accept safe FSM practices or not. Now, the choice of a household to accept or reject a safe FSM practice is effectively a decision. Choosing to use something or not can therefore be based on these behavioral determinants that we're talking about: context, knowledge, attitudes, social norms, control, and intentions. And the whole point in understanding acceptance is so that we can modify the designs of both FSM practices and services to match the needs and values of rural households in Cambodia, and thereby increase diffusion of safe FSM practices across rural Cambodia. So this study in particular looks at how accepting of or resistant to safe FSM practices are rural Cambodian households. So from the FSM survey, I selected 32 questions that describe those 6 behavioral determinants for each household. There were 10 that fell under the context behavioral determinant, 9 under knowledge, 2 attitudes, 6 social norms, 1 control, and 4 intentions. And the responses to each of these questions were scored on a 5-point numerical scale that ranged from 0 up to 4, where 0 indicated a response from a household that's particularly resistant to safe FSM practices, and a response of 4 indicated a response from a household that's particularly accepting of safe FSM practices. I then modeled acceptance using a generalized partial credit model that comes out of item response theory. And item response theory is actually used to score the SAT and GRE tests here in the States. So from item response theory, I used different metrics to look at the quality of the model that I came out with these questions. So I used item characteristic curves, that's the ICCs, discrimination and correlation with the total score of each of the questions. And then from classical test theory, I also used Cronbach's alpha. Based on these metrics, I was able to remove 10 different questions in order to improve the quality of the model. And they primarily came out of context and knowledge up here. I dropped 8 context questions and 2 knowledge questions. So the resulting 22 questions provided sufficient information to describe the complete decision-making process about FSM in rural Cambodia, but it wasn't enough information to describe how much each behavioral determinant affected acceptance. And that was actually something we decided early on with the FSM survey. It would basically require too many questions to really determine which behavioral determinant matters most or matters more. So the resulting acceptance metric was basically a number for each of those 1,472 households that ranged from -3 up to 3, resistant up to accepting, and it described that particular household's acceptance or resistance to safe FSM practices. Plotting those results, we find that 31% of households were particularly resistant to safe FSM practices, many, 44% in the middle at neutral, and 25% were particularly accepting of safe FSM practices. So overall, we find a median value of -0.2, which indicates that rural Cambodian households are generally somewhat resistant to safe FSM practices. So there's a lot of information buried within this number for each household. And that comes out of the specific questions that the households responded to and their responses to those questions. So you can see here, ranging from resistant up to accepting, green, red up to green, for those 22 questions. You can see there's quite a large swath of responses. Instead of going through these one by one, which would be incredibly boring, I split these up into the 6 behavioral determinants, and we'll talk to you about those results now. So first off, taking a look at context, pierced pits, which are a relatively new practice in rural Cambodia, where they basically, the homeowners will install an overflow pipe into the top of their pit that allows liquid fecal sludge to just drain out of their pit when the level rises high enough. Obviously not a good practice, not a very safe practice. Luckily, pierced pits were relatively uncommon. Only 8% of households across the population indicated that they had a pierced pit. However, in individual provinces, that value varied from 2% up to 16%. So there's definitely some variation there. The results also showed that emptying services are largely unavailable to most rural households. Only 18% of households had a service available to them in their community. Looking at knowledge, we found that most households believe that pathogens are present within fecal sludge. However, some households believe that surface release of untreated fecal sludge is safe. So this that's around 11 to 20%, depending on the type of surface release that we're talking about. So although this is well below the majority of households, it's still a cause for concern because public health benefits from sanitation can be mitigated if only a small portion of a population uses unsafe FSM practices. We also found that very few households understand all the different pit emptying practices that are out there, in particularly alternating dual pits. So taking a look at the attitudes behavioral determinant, we found that households generally found that, reported that treatment and disposal locations were important to them. But the devil's in the details on this one. The type of treatment and what constitutes a safe disposal location really isn't well described by the data. So looking at attitudes of safe FSM practices really requires more study. With regard to social norms, most households supported using services and installing an alternating dual pit, and were generally averse to open defecation. And also approval of using services and installing alternating dual pits is also likely going to increase as the diffusion of safe FSM practices and alternating dual pits increases familiarity of these with these services. However, we also found some households strongly support flooding out, that's opening a pit during a flood, and piercing their pits, and half support self-emptying. So these are convenient practices that are actually rooted in religious teachings that are common in rural Cambodia. These religious teachings recommend that human excreta be placed in water and becomes clean when put in water. So this is obviously going to make rural households more resistant to safe FSM practices. In terms of control, most households reported being able to empty for the next 10 years, which is a good thing. However, this result is slightly confounded by the large number of households intending to self-empty over the next 10 years, which is a free practice. And lastly, intentions. These closely mirror the social norms that I've already reported. So that might indicate that social norms are one of the stronger behavioral determinants in the decision-making process for rural Cambodian households. But again, we don't have enough information to conclusively say that. So from these results, I'm strongly recommending that wide-scale behavior change be implemented throughout rural Cambodia. That behavior change campaign really needs to clearly explain the different types of emptying practices that are available, as well as their benefits and risks. And they also need to explain the design, purpose, and use of alternating dual pits in particular. Ideally, there would be easy to understand and culturally cognizant imagery used in this behavior change campaign that would be broadcast over mass media like radio and TV or social media. Also, I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that so many households didn't have emptying services available to them. I can talk all day and we can do research about how rural households make decisions about FSM, but if safe practices aren't available, safe services aren't available, it really isn't going to make any difference. So safe and affordable services really need to be developed along with policy that support and regulate them to allow households to move away from unsafe practices. Then I also took a look at what factors cause acceptance to vary using linear regression. I found that a household member earning a secondary or tertiary degree increased acceptance by 2 and 5%. Having a female decision maker included in the FSM decision-making process increased acceptance by 3%, which is a pretty interesting finding. Although gender does have documented effects on sanitation use and management, and IDE actually has recently shown that having a female latrine sales agent increases household latrine use. It's currently unknown why females increase acceptance here. So it's likely due to the fact that cultural norms place females in charge of caring for children and in caring for elderly more often than males, which might put them in touch with the health of the family more, and therefore they care more about protecting their family in that realm. But we don't have information specifically about that. I also found that living near a river or lake increased acceptance by 2 and 7% respectively. And an interesting finding, and the best icon of my entire PhD run, is that any past experience with fecal sludge, particularly with unsafe emptying, that self-emptying in particular, decreased acceptance by up to 9%. And this really highlights that FSM needs to be discussed with new latrine owners when their latrine is installed. By anchoring FSM from a perspective of safety, we can basically frame FSM in the correct way so that unsafe practices aren't the norm and basically get phased out over time. Lastly, one of the more novel findings of my PhD is that poverty does not affect FSM decision-making. And you'll actually note that this is contradictory to my first study that said that poverty does. So in many studies, poverty has been shown to affect sanitation and specifically FSM decision-making in general. So unfortunately, those studies only looked at a few or just one behavioral determinant and drew conclusions based off of those. This study took a look at all 6 to comprehensively describe the decision-making process with regard to FSM. So ultimately, studies of FSM decision-making really need to describe all behavioral determinants in order to get the complete picture here. And then lastly, I took a look at acceptance and how it varies across different administrative levels regionally in Cambodia. So this map is taking a look at the mean acceptance of safe FSM practices within different administrative boundaries, red being resistant up to green being accepting of safe FSM practices. So taking a look first at the province level, you can see that different provinces, that's kind of these bigger, darker boxes here, range quite a bit. So for example, the worst average provincial acceptance was down here in Prey Veng, having a value of -0.52. And just right next door in Kandal, this kind of circular province, had a mean provincial level acceptance of 0.6. So there's a lot of variation across the provinces. Moving one step lower, looking at the districts, that's kind of these, they're effectively counties comparing to the US, and it's these guys that look like this. We find wide variation within some provinces like Kandal, again, that's the circular one here. A lot of districts are green, whereas others are more orange, indicating lower acceptance. And conversely, we find narrow variation in certain provinces, like again, Prey Veng right here, which is generally just kind of orange, indicating a moderate level of acceptance. However, when we look at the statistics, most districts within a province were not statistically different from the other districts in that province, which means that the provincial acceptance metrics typically are going to be adequate to describe what's going on in each province. And then lastly, looking at the villages, obviously we don't have any statistical significance here because we only surveyed 6 households in each village. But I just wanted to draw your attention to certain districts, like this one, for example, has many villages that are particularly accepting of safe FSM practices and one that's not. And they tend to be, they can be right next to each other. So there's a lot of variation even within villages, even between villages that are nearby. So in summary, my first study looked at context and intentions related to FSM, and I showed that many households intend to perform unsafe practices. And those intentions tend to vary with demographics, time, and region within the country. Based on these results, I'm recommending that these variations be considered when improving FSM practices and services and the programs that support them. And lastly, FSM decision-making really should be described by more behavioral determinants than just context. Second, looking at preferences for FSM service attributes, I showed that households desire FSM services and prefer preventing contact with fecal sludge most out of the attributes that we looked at. From these results, I'm strongly recommending that FSM services prevent contact with fecal sludge first and foremost, because it is a goal of safe sanitation, but also a strong preference for rural households. And then offer pricing tiers that can provide the attributes of reducing foul odor, producing fertilizer from fecal sludge, and/or reducing time to service delivery. Additionally, FSM services should be marketed using these attributes because we know households care about them. Lastly, from this study, the actual willingness to pay for these different attributes is currently unknown and really needs to be studied in more detail. Lastly, looking at the acceptance of safe FSM practices, currently households are somewhat resistant to safe FSM practices due to both a lack of knowledge as well as deeply rooted social norms that make them more resistant to safe FSM practices. So I'm strongly recommending a targeted behavior change campaign across rural Cambodia that particularly explains emptying practices and alternating dual pits via mass and social media. We should also be anchoring the perspectives of new latrine owners with regard to safe FSM practices when their latrines are installed to mitigate any comfort that might come from using unsafe practices. And lastly, household decision-making really does matter, but without something safe to switch to, it's not going to matter very much. So developing safe and affordable services along with policies is going to allow households to move away from unsafe FSM practices. So thank you all very much for your time and attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. And what I may suggest is if you go to the participant list, you should be able to raise your hand because this is the time for public questions. And usually there's applause, so I'll just applaud for myself. All right, any questions? Oh, Rita.
Yes, a great job, James.
Thank you, Rita.
It's so great. I want you to come to class now and give a talk. So you maybe
You got it. I'm totally there.
behavioral determinants are just exactly what we're reading about for the next week. But a question for you that I think others ask themselves. You know, when you were asking about the attributes, and there was a big reaction to not wanting to come in contact with the fecal sludge. Do you have any information on why that was? Which would usually back up health doesn't have anything to do with it. It's disgusting. We don't like talking about it. It's socially unacceptable. It lowers my status amongst my neighbors, etc. Just wondering if you
definitely, yeah. So in rural Cambodia, there's this concept called Meruk, M-E-R-U-K. And it's this, it's a Khmer word that basically describes anything that you don't want to touch. So there's this basically a cultural norm around Meruk that makes people want to stay away from it. There's this idea that smelling Meruk can make you sick. So that's where the preference for reducing foul odor comes from. And so there's basically just a lot of cultural norms around aversion to fecal sludge in general. However, what's really interesting is there's kind of this dichotomy in rural Cambodia that particularly developed during the Khmer Rouge in the late 70s, where they were basically forced to use fecal sludge as fertilizer. And so while there's this tradition of use of fecal sludge as fertilizer, there's also this cultural norm of being averse to it. So that's also another one of the reasons why we end up with that strong preference heterogeneity across the population, is because some households care about the traditions more and some care about using fecal sludge more. But yeah, it basically comes down to those traditions around Miruk.
Thanks.
Any other questions for James? All right. Well, if there is no more questions, I don't think I see any more hands raised or anything in the chat, then we will excuse the public, and thank you so much for spending an hour learning about fecal sludge management and supporting James.
Thank you all.